Next steps to happiness? Further hypnosis reflections on the Psychological Therapies Reference Group meeting, 18th of September 2007. Hypnosis left the reference group meeting for Somerset House to see the Courtauld Institute's Adam and Eve exhibition. And there I was reminded by the Cranach paintings of the special virtues of images in helping us appreciate hidden power relations, and especially landscapes. 8 years ago, Hypnosis published a tiny series of drawings that showed the open prairie of UK psychopractice, happily populated by a sprinkling of practitioner-client dyads. Other drawings showed the imperious fencing off of a sector of the prairie by the UKCP and the BCP, over which they claimed possession/jurisdiction. Inside the fenced-off area of this gated community, pointy bureaucratic hierarchies had been erected and security systems installed to admit the professionalised righteous into the fold and to damn the charlatans to exclusion. Imaging such bizarrely incongruous domineering and bullying behaviour in this way was intended to feed resistance to this folly. It was intended to appeal to practitioners who, if lacking in professionalised righteousness, were less susceptible to being entranced than the inhabitants behind the wire. This was the landscape of the Alderdice period. As the noble lord, and Hypnosis, found, when he ignored the British Association of Counselling, BAC as it then was, in writing his psychotherapy bill, it was a seriously deficient picture. Yes, the BAC, soon to become the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, was missing, and so were the British Psychological Society and also the Department of Health. What would such a landscape look like today? Contributions at the September the 18th reference group meeting pointed to a much expanded landscape. The fenced-off section of prairie of the mainstream accrediting and training bodies is still there, but it now resembles a slightly run-down industrial park, protected by security fencing and surveillance cameras. The pointy British Confederation of Psychoanalysts building, surrounded by barbed wire, is still in place. And off to one side are the 80 sheds housing the UKCP's training enterprises. Adjacent to them arise the regal columns of the British Psychological Society's premises, and nearby are the vast, touchingly half-timbered British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy premises. Adjacent to this industrial estate is a sparkling new science park, from which is rising a high-tech, multi-storey block still crowned with cranes. A huge neon sign on the side of the building with the letters CBT announces its ownership. Some way in the distance, rising out of the plain, is a mist-shrouded mountain range. Dotted around on it are a series of government fortresses, whose worn stones testify to Parliament's formative history of centuries of tribal conflict. The ancient stone towers are now festooned with satellite dishes, aerials and surveillance cameras that constantly scan the surrounding countryside and communicate with the other .gov fortresses. The National Health Service Castle, by far the largest of the collection, extends from some way up the mountain right down onto the plain. It's a motley collection of new office blocks and old refurbished barracks and inflatable bouncy castles. Oh yes, and the NHS site also has its own science park housing, if you're not already drowning in acronyms, the CHRE, NICE and Skills for Health. A country lane running between the old industrial estate housing the mainstream accrediting bodies and the government fortresses shows little signs of use. However, bulldozers and trucks are at work on the foundations for a new road between the NHS site and the CBT Science Park. If we zoom back a bit, we can see off to the right yet another feature in the landscape, another science park, set in its own grounds and protected by a moat with a drawbridge, is a new stainless steel and glass building cunningly constructed in the form of a portcullis. It houses the HPC. If we can accept this daft but I believe accurate enough picture of the state of play in our occupations of counselling, psychotherapy, psychology and psychoanalysis, what might be missing? A valuable contribution to the September 18 reference group meeting was an outline by an insider of the projected growth of the government's programme for increasing access to psychological therapies, IAPT, as a feature of this landscape. The view from inside was that IAPT fits very well the global move in the NHS towards the commissioning of services, not least those devoted to mental health. Anyone can apply to be an IAPT pathfinder. What a curious choice of name. In World War II, pathfinders identified targets for bomber squadrons. So what does all this mean for our landscape of psychopractice? The IAPT, Increasing Access to Psychological Therapies initiative, promises to add a major suburb to the NHS metropolis. And the National Occupational Standards motorway between the IAPT suburb and the NHS, with spur roads to the Health Professions Council and the CBT premises, are already being built. This National Occupational Standards NOS motorway entirely bypasses the premises of the mainstream psychopractice accrediting bodies. This picture of the psychopractice landscape, as seen from an IPN viewpoint, points to a couple of generic consequences. 1. If registrants with the mainstream bodies sign up to be registered with the Health Professions Council, they will enter a direct one-to-one relationship, the same as they have with the DVLA or the Inland Revenue, and the only set of fees they will need to pay will be to the Health Professions Council. Why would they want to continue financial support of the mainstream training/accrediting organisations? Secondly, there is a prospect of a huge increase in the numbers of low-paid, modestly skilled, quote, mental health care workers, unquote, to handle the high-volume, low-intensity work of meeting clients' needs. Such workers would be jointly regulated by their employer, the NHS, and the Health Professions Council, and they would need to be trained and educated. But such services not only have to be fit for purpose, they have to be acceptable to users. Psychological therapy services. This doesn't sound all that user-friendly, does it? Could they be rebranded? How about next steps to happiness?